Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the fourth in our 5-week series of Clergy Conversations. We're talking to the amazing group of retired clergy people who have decided to call First and Central their home. If you're not aware of how things work in the Presbyterian Church, it's pretty much considered not very proper for Presbyterian ministers to return to churches at which they have preached. So they get to decide where they want to go after they retire. And we are blessed to have 7 of them among us. And today we have the husband and wife couple of Neta Pringle and John Potter, who I think most everybody knows. They've certainly been around Wilmington for a long time. I'm not going to go through the bio. It's in the email this morning that contained the link to this Zoom meeting. We have about half an hour, 35 minutes to talk with Neta and John, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So let's get right into it. Since we're in the middle of searching for a pastor, and both of you have had experience as interims, I didn't realize Neta just a couple minutes ago was saying she's been interim in about 6 different times, and John about 15. So that's a lot of interims. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what some of the challenges were of being an interim and how you overcame them.
Well, it's a whole new set of people to get to know, number one. And every church, I mean, on the surface, Presbyterian churches operate the same, but down underneath, they don't. And so one of the things that I used to do is I would ask each elder to give me 1 hour. And I would say, tell me about yourself and tell me about the church. And I learned a lot that way. It gave me a real feel for how they saw the church, what they thought was important out of the church, kind of a feel for the people in the congregation. And I found that a tremendously helpful way to start, because they give you all these things you're supposed to do, but I'm really convinced a lot of interim ministry is intuition, as you kind of figure out what's going on and what that church is going to need from you and how you can be helpful. John, you've done more than I have.
An intuitive person, I always feel that if by the time I get there, I haven't sniffed anything in the wind, something's wrong. I'm usually pretty perceptive about the system. But part of that is that, there are 2 sets of interim tasks. There's the interim tasks. This came out of studies by the Alban Institute down in Washington, D.C., next to the National Cathedral, back in the 1970s. They studied congregations that went through successful transitions, and they found that there were 5 things that most of them did. And that became known as the interim tasks. Well, they're the congregation's tasks. But the first task of the minister is to join the system. Because until you join the system, you can't do anything. And that takes a while. And then the second job of the minister is to help the congregation through its working on those 5 tasks. And the third thing is to get the hell out.
Can you talk a little?
I also think you're not there to you're not there to remake the congregation in your style.
I will respond, but I will not initiate. I'm sorry, Neta.
Talk a little bit more about what that means to join the system. What does that mean?
That somehow you have to have a sense of how the system works. It's what Neta was talking about. It's not the book of order. It's the actual way that congregation, what it values, who the real leaders are, is the session the leadership, or is it the old guard that is the leadership? Who's fighting whom? The next to the last church I served, there were 2 octogenarians on opposite ends of town who had been fighting each other since junior high school. And when one of them died, somebody else would get elected to take their place and not even know there was an election. That was just the nature of that system. It's been going on for 200 years.
So when you say system, you're talking about the specific congregation.
Yeah.
Tell me, both of you, some experiences you've had where you came in as an interim and were really surprised by what you found, and how what you found was completely different from what you expected, and what you did to make that relationship work.
I try to go without expectations, because I want to stay open to letting that church speak to me. So in some ways, I try not to have expectations, but I think there's also a sense in which you just have all your antenna out, in a sense of what's going on, what's really happening here. The last church I was in had been through a major fight, major. And there was just a lot of pain and a lot of hurt. The one gift in all that was that the really angriest people had left. And saying to the congregation, you know, they really did you a favor, because they're not here to stir the pot, and they're not here to keep, you know, got to walk around eggshells around these people. But there was a lot of hurt. And part of it was just being sensitive to that and affirming people, and telling them they were going to be okay, that they were going to get through it. Church basically was a strong church. It was much stronger than, it had a wonderful founding pastor. And while he'd been gone for 20 years, the sense of, there's a very healthy piety in that church. And that's kind of an old-fashioned word to use, but it was a very healthy piety that had survived all this mess. And so just giving it room to breathe and open up, and people said, I feel like I'm back to the church we started with. So can I tell you specifically things? I think some of it's what you carry inside yourself. I think some of it is just, you know, being open all the time to what was going on until you could figure it out. John, what have you done?
Well, I was going to say the two that really tripped me up. The first one was my first interim in this presbytery, which was Ellesmere. And Ellesmere, years back, one of their pastors thought the Methodists had a great idea to have a chief lay officer. So they had one. It wasn't the clerk of session, it was John Lewis. And he was a good presbyter, he was faithful and so on. And I ended up trusting him more than I should have, because he ran that place with a strict, and then I only realized 2/3 of the way through that I should have done something to soften that. And the other was in this church that I mentioned with 200 years of conflict. I relied on the advice of the Presbytery executive rather than on the Holy Spirit. I'll never do that again. I got my tail on a sling for the 2 years I was there. So that business, Neta says, you keep your antenna out, and you trust the Spirit, and you trust your intuition more than you trust other people's take on things.
I had one interim that it was the hardest one I did. And I followed a pastor who'd been there for 20 plus years. He was quite literally the only pastor that most people in that congregation had ever had. The church was basically run by 3 men. And in retrospect, I think they looked at me and thought, oh, nice, charming lady, we can run things through her. And were sort of shocked to discover that, yeah, sometimes you could, but sometimes you couldn't. And that I had a mind of my own. So they didn't renew me at the end of a year. On the other hand, the pastor who came there is still there. So I must have done something right, because that's, I think, the best way to judge the effectiveness of an interim is, are the pastors who follow you able to really stay? And my sense has always been that's where my accountability lies. It lies to the new pastor, that what I do needs to make things right for them. And so you don't impose your own stuff, but you try to help a congregation work through whatever grudge they have so they're ready.
You know, as I listen to the two of you talk, and I think about First and Central's experience, it seems like being an interim pastor would be the last thing that anyone would want to do. So you must really love what you do in order to keep doing it, keep going back.
Well, people say interim ministry is a hard job. I say every job is hard. You just pick your problems. With interim ministry, we don't have to do everything. We can pick what we need to do in that situation and then wash our hands of it and we're free.
And we seem to have a lot of consultants in my family. And I decided interim ministry is a lot like being a consultant, where, I mean, you know, you do the basic stuff to keep the church running, but you also work with them to move on to the next stage, to sort out whatever problem they have, etc. It must be in the genes somewhere.
The consultants will always point out we don't do implementation.
Yeah.
Neta, talk a little bit about what it's like to come in to a church that had been so male dominated, or predominantly male dominated, which I guess is redundant, and some of the reactions. You know, how you overcame some of those built-in prejudice might be too strong, but some assumptions and stereotypes. And I guess I'm curious if when they looked at the ministry. When they looked at your form, did you have the home ec degree on the form? So did that get you,
No, I just had Bachelor of Science, I think is what I carried. Well, you know, it's interesting. I think of myself as having been in the second wave of women coming into ministry. There were the brave souls like Pat McClurg who were really on the front wave, and I'll tell you, they had a tough time, and they did a lot to break ground. I think it does sometimes surprise people that I am not a pushover. You know, I have good social skills. So they look at me and think, oh, you know, this will be a nice lady. She'll take care of us. Well, yeah, I will. But I also have some pretty strong, I'm my father's daughter in many ways. So I think that's one piece. The other thing I discovered is how women in the congregation react to you. Because women who are leaders in that church have worked really hard to get there, you know, especially, it's not as bad now as it used to be, but, you know, 30 years ago, those women had worked hard to get to a place where they held some leadership positions. And as a woman pastor, you just walk in and you've handed them. They're yours. So that can be resented. And there were things I never did. I stayed out of the kitchen. I stayed out of church dinners. I stayed out of how the place was decorated because I felt like they didn't need that from me. They needed to have their own territory. So I grew up with three brothers. I like to think I'm comfortable working with men. And I've never really had a problem with that, particularly, although every once in a while there was a guy who would have trouble. And you could just see him really struggling. And you just have to give him room to struggle. And I was there to do a job and to be a professional, and that's what I needed to do.
Switching gears a little bit, I wonder if the two of you could talk, both maybe give an interim example and also a called pastor example of some stewardship challenges and what you did to overcome them.
Well, my last church I walked into, and they had no money. They had used every cent in their overdraft. You know, people who were angry sat on their wallets, and so they had no money. And I was sitting there thinking, oh man, what am I going to do? Well, I discovered their idea of stewardship was they would have Stewardship Sunday, and people would bring their pledges and put them in the bowl, but they wouldn't sign them. And somebody would pick up the bowl and put it in the closet. So they had no sense of reality between what people were giving and what they weren't, and how to budget. And as I'm going, okay, we really need a stewardship campaign. This great guy walked into my office. He says, I'm retired military. I've been a member of churches all over the country. I've never done a stewardship campaign, but we need one here, and here's my plan. Thank you, Jesus. So we started doing, the previous pastor did not like to talk about money. It was all on faith. And so the finance committee really worked hard to teach the congregation what's going on. They were very open. They held forums. They put out budgets. I mean, they did all that kind of stuff. And then we had a genuine stewardship campaign where we didn't just talk about why I belong to this church, but what we do with the money, how much it needs, what it costs to run this place. We worked really hard at just informing people. And I also said to them, you can't call a pastor until you get your money in order. Because, you know, Randy Clayton went down to Baltimore to take a church down there. He was there a year and realized they didn't have any money left to pay him. And they had to close the church. And I said, this happens, and you cannot do this to a new pastor. They move their family here, etc. You've got to know that you can continue to pay them. So between the work that the finance committee and the stewardship guy and just being open and honest, I had them in the black. They paid off their debts. So they had enough money to call a new pastor by the time I left. So that was pretty good.
And within a year or two, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it really turned around. Well, partly they got over being mad. And so instead of giving their money to the Kenya scholarships, they gave it to the church. And it really did turn around. It's great.
Well, you make it sound very easy. I'm sure it's not as easy as it sounds. Our own experience.
Well, it was the really group of people that went after that and worked on it. And they knew what to do. They just had never been allowed to. So
if you still have the military man's plan in your desk drawer, maybe you want to share it with us. John, how about you? You have an example you can share?
It's not stewardship is not as hard as you make it out to be. I think of two things. One was my third interim was an 800-member church whose previous pastor, 20 years, had prejudice against endowments. And it was a Field of Dream church, as you know. It was built, when you build it, they will come. And so everything could work on current income and so on. And this was in the late 80s, and the times had changed. And I knew very well that unless they started providing for the future, then the membership would diminish, the income would diminish, and they'd have a big building to maintain and no way to do it. So I got them to take seriously not just their current income, but the possibility of protecting their investment into the future, which is not normally a part of stewardship. But I mean, if they're going to be stewards of what was given to them, that's a part of it. The other one is the last church I served, last interim, had not had a stewardship campaign in 20 or 30 years. And I was told by one of the leaders, if you try it, it will backfire. People will resent it and the results will be negative. Well, I tried it. We did Consecration Sunday. I had the executive of the synod come in and preach. And by the end of the day, they had recorded a 15 or 20% increase in income, projected income. And they're like, whoa. And it wasn't that hard. It just, it just took somebody willing to make a decision to do it.
And to be real open about what it costs to run a church.
Yeah, I mean, the simple things. Church, people give not according to their ability, but according to their knowledgeability.
Yeah.
It's important to put out the statistics of what's going on. How many people give at this level? How many people give at this level? How many people give at this level? One of the questions I was asked, well, if the giving is poor, will that discourage big givers from giving as much? And maybe I've never experienced that. The more you tell about what's going on, the more people will respond.
I think that's good advice for us, and it's not too soon for us to start planning our stewardship campaign for this fall. Ellen Euler's not with us this morning, but she's run the stewardship campaign for the past number of years, and she's has just come off session, and she may help us out, but she's looking for someone else to lead it. So we're gonna have that. We're gonna be looking for the new stewardship leader going forward. Just talk a little, switching gears again, talk a little bit about how you both got to the point where you were retiring. You worked in a lot of different places, a lot of different presbyteries, a lot of different size markets. You decided to make your home in Wilmington, where there's certainly no shortage of Presbyterian churches from which to choose. What made you land at First and Central?
John, you went there first, and I kind of followed along, but
Yeah, I was there back when Vin was pastor. Elizabeth got a hold of me, and I was kind of her confidant in a sense. And then I was on the administrative commission during the interim when John Dean was the interim pastor. So I had an involvement in various ways before I started attending. And, you know, when we moved to Wilmington, when I wasn't working, I'd check out other churches. It's hard to find good preaching and good music. You can sometimes find one, but not the other. And that's where I ended up when I wasn't working. And when Doug first came, we kind of went like that, and I had to spend a year in exile until he got comfortable with my presence. And we've had a good relationship after that.
and I had two primary things. One is my church on Long Island was about as diverse as you'd ever find. And so I've really come to value diversity. And that First and Central isn't as diverse as my church in Hempstead, but it's got a lot of good diversity, and I really value that. So that was one piece of it. And then I grew up in churches that had really wonderful music, and that's such an important part of my worship that it's what I miss when I'm not at First and Central. This is really wonderful music, because David, you can take a bow. You have a good sense not only of being a musician, but being a good church musician, which is different from being a good musician. So I really have valued those two things particularly. And then I like the size of the congregation. It doesn't need to be, it needs to be a little bigger, but I find that there's something about a smaller congregation that feels more like family than I grew up in great big churches, and they're wonderful. You know, there isn't anything you can't do because you've got people to do them. But I really do value, I think, the sort of sense of community you develop in a little bit smaller church.
And for me, the urban part was important. I spent 13 years in an inner city church in a Black neighborhood. And when we moved to Wilmington, I insisted we live in the city. So for the first 10 years, we lived a block behind John Walton's church at 14th and Rodney.
I love that garden, by the way. That was a spectacular garden you had.
Thank you.
And you
very blessed. I've got a nice garden here too, so I'm working at putting it back in shape.
You just moved into Cokesbury, and you already have pictures on the wall. So I guess the move's going well. The unpacking and settling in.
I found clothes to wear this morning, and we.
Well, just with all the experience that both of you have had, what's the most important piece of advice you would give to the congregation as we go through this change?
Well, number one, it is change. And you can't expect the new pastor to just be like the old one. Or sometimes congregations think, well, the new pastor will have all the virtues of the former pastor and none of their none of their failings, and they're going to be different. They'll have their own strengths, they'll have their own weaknesses, and they'll do things differently, and get used to it. That's part of what happens. That's one piece. The other piece, I think, as you go forward beyond that, as maybe I've missed something in the discussions, but it seems to me that you need to reach out to more and more people are living in the city who are good Presbyterian style fodder. I mean, Presbyterians tend to attract people who are reasonably well educated and are sort of cerebral in their approach to faith. And there are a lot of people who work in the city, who are living in the city anymore. Some of them are older, some of them are younger. And they use the church as a vehicle for their social service, for their service to others. And so the fact that you have that opportunity in front of them should be a draw. And how can you reach out and incorporate more white collar people who are working in those offices downtown, who are living around that area, who would value the sense of community that churches offer? That's one of the things the churches in New York City discovered. And one of their big draws was in a big impersonal city, they offered community. So I would challenge you to think real constructively about how you reach out to some of those folks.
The other thing that I would note is that at least in my time with the church, everything tended to center on the weekends because of parking. It was like, we can't do stuff during the week because it's too expensive to come in and park. And I want to challenge that. I think part of having a building is using it, and it needs to be open and open to the community, and have things going on in the church that will draw people in. Shelly Waters was a longtime member of the staff of the Synod of Pennsylvania, Synod of the Trinity. He was former pastor of First African Presbyterian Philadelphia. And he visited my church in Harrisburg one day, and with a grin on his face said, "Lord, save me from a church with clean walls." That's a sign of disuse. That building needs to be vital. It needs to have kids and adults flowing in and out of it for various things. I know there's a security issue around that. There are all sorts of issues around it. But if it's only really open 1 or 2 days a week, it's closed.
The other piece I think we're all learning out of the pandemic, and it's one of the sort of gifts that it brought us, is how much you can do with Zoom or with electronics. And a lot of churches, even before now, have been live streaming their worship service, and found that for people who are homebound for one reason or another, or away, or even people who don't even live in the area, find that church. My brother lived in northern Maine, and he said, "Neta, people up here don't know how to preach." Well, he discovered that the Haddonfield church in which we had grown up was live streaming their service. And he would go to church at Haddonfield from his remote place in Maine. So I think all of that stuff is something to be explored and worked on. And I hear people say it's not as easy as you think it is, but I've seen small churches do it. So I think it can be done. So that's a challenge I would lay before you. Just don't lose, rather than record it in pieces. It's the strangest thing when you record it. You welcome everybody and you preach, and then you do something else. It's all disjointed and you can't kind of warm up to it. But that's as an aside. The fact that we have the technology and people are more and more accustomed to using it, how can churches use that to expand the ministry that they have.
And we got somebody who's used to it because Bill Getman did it in Haddonfield. He knows it. And I worked with Christiana Church and the Unglued Church Project. And when they started out, all they could think of in Mission was their 200-year-old building with no bathrooms. And by the time they got to the end of it, they had made connections with the community. But more to the point, they had begun to do live streaming. And during the pandemic, they found they had more people in worship than they had ever had because they were live streaming. So I've been hammering on that.
I think those points are well taken, and those are what you mentioned are some of the things in our mission study report that I find very exciting, moving in that direction. And also the idea that connecting with the community doesn't necessarily mean getting people involved in the worship aspect of what we do, but there's plenty of other things that we can do as well. I'm looking at the time, so I don't have a sense of whether or not anybody has any questions, but we can open it up for questions if anybody has something they'd like to ask Neta or John. Margaret Ann, not seeing any hands raised, and I don't see anything in the
see
chat.
two, actually, David Teeger and then Noble, please.
So when we had a clergy couple before, it was discussed what sort of joint activities they had ever done as part of their ministries. And do you have anything to share on that aspect?
We spent 1 year sharing. When I went to be the interim at Limestone, we needed an associate. And I came home and I said to John, how'd you feel about being an interim associate? And kind of joking. And he said, are you serious? And I said, no, but I could be. And we wound up with him as the interim associate for a year. We liked it, and because it was the first time we'd really shared a church, I found that it was not a way I wanted to be forever. That it was limiting to both of us, I think. John, do you want to make any comments about clergy?
Well, it was fun because it was the only time I was a youth minister, and Lori Lovelace said, aren't you a little old for that? And I said, yes.
She had a great time with the kids. I think it depends on the couple. And I think it's a different kind of marital relationship when you share a job. And I've known clergy couples who started out that way, and it was not a good arrangement for them. But some people love it.
On the other hand, being a clergy couple in two different places, we always talk about the liturgy of the ice cubes at 5 p.m. That's when we would deprogram with each other. We'd put out the day, and having a clergy spouse means you don't have to explain.
Yeah.
We both understand what's going on.
And you both work weird hours, so you work kind of the same sort of weird hours. Whereas I think the hardest thing on a clergy is being married to somebody who works 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, because that's not when we work the hardest. And so your schedules don't merge very well.
We have a question. I'm sorry, we have a question from Noble, and then we have a question from Sarah Ryan.
John, Anita, you were asked what advice you would give to our congregation. I would follow that up with, what advice would you give to a pastor considering the call at First and Central?
You are blessed with really wonderful leadership in this congregation, but you have to know how to work with that kind of leadership. Some pastors like to do it my way. They're sort of what we call a hair pastor. And you need to have someone who's really respectful of and willing to work with strong lay leadership. That would be the one piece that I would really put out there.
I don't know what to add to that. I think that's good.
I mean, the obvious stuff is the location and trying to figure out what you do with city churches. That's, as one friend of ours says, success doesn't translate, only failure. Each situation is different. But you need somebody who can figure out how best to help this church move into the future.
Sarah.
Oh, so John, you're mentioning being a youth pastor jogged my thinking. And one of our challenges is attracting families and figuring out also how to provide programming when we only have a limited number of children, because the programming for children then, or lack of programming certainly isn't going to attract families. But if we only have one minister going forward, then that's a lot for that minister to also be in charge of programming. So what thoughts do you have about how we should think about programming, and especially how we can think about programming starting now instead of having to wait for a new minister to kind of think about what we can do for children?
Well, I'm wondering if there aren't other city churches in the same boat who have some kids, but not enough to really build a program. And maybe you can do some joint stuff. I mean, you're doing justice stuff with Sam's. I don't know whether that's a possibility or not, but we don't need to do everything by ourselves. I mean, I have no magic key for this issue.
I also think a lot of youth ministries that succeed are often ones that are led by members of the congregation who have that gift, and that's their energy, and you back them up and you support them, but a lot of the basic stuff gets done by your volunteers from the church. And I don't see that being explored at First and Central.
I related this story to somebody the other night. My mother died when I was 12. And so as a teenager, I was knocking around between my home church and the Reformed church across the street, which had a Christian Endeavor program going. And I got to know the pastor there, a guy named Joe Perry. And what I didn't realize is that when he left Linden, he came to Wilmington to be the pastor of Hanover Church. And when I got here, he sent me a letter and said, let's have lunch. And he'd been looking out for me all that time. And that was more important than any programming and any fancy stuff. Just to have somebody who cared when my life was at loose ends.
The one thing that I've tried and I would not recommend is I've had seminary interns who did the youth ministry, but they were there for a year, maybe 2 years at best, and they just begin to build the program when they'd leave. And then the next person would come and they'd have to sort of start all over again. It's too disjointed. You need some continuity with kids. That's an important piece of it.
Good advice. While we think with it, while we wait to see if anybody else has any questions or comments, I want to, John, your comment about going over the liturgy with ice cubes. It's a shame that we were unable to share both Neta and John submitted separate bios, and their styles were very different. Neta's was sort of very, factual to the point. John's was full of, very much demonstrated, exemplified his wry sense of humor. And if you read the bio, you know that for some time he was in Linden Neta was in Hempstead, New York. They were married, and John was talking about, Neta talked about how they had a commuter marriage. John talked about how they were getting ready to sublet an apartment on underneath the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. So, a great sense of humor, and I think that's you haven't
It's
spoken
very
about,
helpful, yes.
yeah, you haven't spoken about that directly, but I can imagine that has to be a very important part. Before we sign off, do you want to talk a little bit about how it is that you both came to be sort of through different paths, but you both ended up with wanting to do work in Cuba?
I had gathered a group of pastors who met every year for a week and would seek out a place where we could find a resource person. It's sort of like John and Walton's and Nita's movable feast, only it wasn't a lectionary group. And Jeff Craybill was a part of that. And one year he said, instead of finding somebody who can affect our lives, why don't we go someplace? And my sister can set us up for a week in Cuba. And this was in 1999, and I fell in love with the place and didn't know how to get back there until 2008, when Neta was in the interim over in Woodbury, New Jersey, and found a woman who had come up from Baltimore, where they have a heavy connection with Cuba and had her own relationship with this church. And Neta said, would you like to go? And I said, well, twist my arm. And that's the end of the story. I've been there 30 times since then. Fallen in love with the place and with the people. It's my Cuban family.
I miss them right now.
Hmm.
And life is really hard there right now.
I don't know if anybody on the call this morning has been on one of the trips that John has
Yeah,
taken.
Sarah went.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah.
Brenda, yeah.
There's also, I will say that the year that John took the youth group, which was 2017, that was life-changing for those kids. So it's something that frankly they still talk about.
It's a very different world.
You know, and the thing is, going to a place where the church has at times been oppressed and even now is on kind of tender relationships with the government. Right now, what they're concerned, they've got maybe 24 living water for the world installations there. And part of that is you get that installation, you have to provide the water for your neighborhood. And now the government is talking about metering all of the water. And that means they won't be able to afford to do living waters. And so there's this strange relationship with the government that's not oppressive, but it's certainly not helpful. And to go to a place where people have next to nothing, where the average monthly income was under $20, they depended on the little ration that they get from the government to hold, not to do anything but except provide some very basic stuff. And to find a faith that is so vibrant and so powerful and so living, you know, they think that we come there and help them. I go there to get fed. It's changed my preaching.
It changes the way you look at the world. It really does. One of their ministries is, there are a lot of people whose families have gone to America, and these older people wind up living sort of in one room. And they have, you know, really very little. And washing clothes gets to be a big, both expense and awkward, because they don't have washing machines or laundromats or anything like that. So they come to the church and they bring their laundry and they have lunch. The church does their laundry, mends their clothes, and sends them home again. So Ramona, who runs that, said to me, could you bring me some thread sometime? I'm going, thread? You don't have thread? So, periodically in whatever church, I would say to people, clean out your sewing cabinets. If you've got quite a bit of thread left on something, I don't care what color it is, I'll take it down. Well, the women over those churches in the years have provided thread and needles and pins and scissors and, just really backed up that stuff. And so my view is I take things to help them do their ministry. We don't go to do things for them. But if I can take things that help them do what they're trying to do, that makes all kinds of sense to me.
See, you're
And the first time you took
Oh,
that
that's
down,
great.
I was in tears.
Oh yeah, but when I handed her a bag of thread, she was in tears. And it's like, you want to think you don't have much.
Well, it's good advice, good approach to remember, especially as we think about outreach to the community, which is not going into the community and saying, here's what we can
It's,
do.
I
Go
keep
ahead,
calling it a pilgrimage rather than a mission trip. We go there to get fed, to get healed. Yes, we do stuff for them. But the real thing is, how does it change us when we go? And it's not a mission trip, it's a pilgrimage.
Well, we look forward to the day when you can
We
take
can all
another
go back, yeah.
Yeah. I'm mindful of the time, so before we wrap up, I just want to say that to thank Neta and John, and to remind you all that next week is the conclusion of the Explorers Forum for the 2021 season. We won't be back until after Labor Day, but next week we'll hear from John Walton, and that will wrap up the series. So if nobody has any closing comments or anything else to say, I will just say thank you all for being with us this morning. Happy Pentecost, and hopefully we'll see you next week.
Nice to talk about our work.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.